April. All right, so to start out, if you wouldn't mind spelling your first and last name for me, please, sir.
Sure, Mark West, M-A-R-K-W-E-S-T.
And you were president of the Chattanooga Tea Party for how long?
Right at 10 years.
So when did it start? Were you there when it founded?
Yes, I was the founder back in April of 2009.
And when did you kind of step down as president?
At the end of 2018. Yeah, that was officially the resignation. I had been kind of shying away or leaning away, seeing I was going to be moving on over the last couple of years or so of my tenure there.
Well, let's talk about, in the 12 years that the Chattanooga Tea Party existed, what were some of the things that you guys did, things that you're proud of?
Well, I think the organization accomplished a lot locally, more than nationally, actually. And we were founded initially to protest some national politicians and so forth, but we turned our attention to things locally because we felt like that's where we could get the most effort or bang for our buck, so to speak. And so I think really, we were able to achieve a number of things here while we were focused locally.
So, understand, I read the current president's letter, and part of what he cited for the reason for disbanding was, I guess, fundraising issues and potentially participation or trouble with participation or engagement or something like that. Do you have any insight as to why the organization ended up disbanding?
I think the Tea Party was originally founded not just to be a part of the Republican Party, but to be a separate entity and to really hold both parties accountable. And I think what happened was the Tea Party, little by little, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, became one and the same. There was no difference between the Republican Party and the Tea Party. And so really, what was the purpose for it to be there? It became, whether it was co-opted or whether it willingly kind of folded in with the Republican Party. Because for many years during the Tea Party most active days, it was zeroing in on Republicans as well as Democrats as far as trying to address its core principles.
When you're talking about those core principles that either were, became standard in the Republican Party or whatever it may be, what were those core principles that you're talking about?
Boy, it's a really easy thing because we were founded on those 3 core principles, which was really a national perspective, and one was fiscal conservatism. The federal government was out of control, and the second was a limited government, and the third was adherence to the Constitution. But what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, which is what really kind of began leading me away from the Tea Party, was really as soon as it gained power in Washington, those core principles no longer were an issue. You've seen during the last 4 years the greatest amount of accumulation of debt in the history of our nation, $8 trillion under a Republican president, and the Tea Party has been absolutely entirely silent. We've seen a president has gone wild with executive orders. When I was the president of the Tea Party, that was a no-no. We were constantly harping against executive orders. But for the last 4 years, it's been silent. You have a president who routinely trampled on the Constitution over the last 4 years. The Tea Party, as well as Republicans, were silent. It's interesting, their laryngitis has left them, and now they're actively vocal again. They're now concerned about deficits, concerned about growing government, and concerned about the constitutional issues. So I just see that there's not a consistency, and so it's really critical that the Tea Party, if it was going to still exist, it has to maintain its own separate identity and not just be one of the Republican Party.
So at this point, do you identify with the Tea Party still, or do you kind of just consider yourself a Republican?
No, I'm not a Republican. I haven't been a Republican for many years, and I'm not a Tea Partier either. Actually, what began to happen in my own personal life 5 years ago was much greater than politics, and I began seeing that there really is no political solution to a spiritual problem. Racism is not a political problem; it's a spiritual problem. Hate is not a political problem. You cannot legislate love. You cannot legislate kindness. You cannot legislate these types of things that flow from the heart. And so I began to realize this 5 years ago, and that was really why I left the Tea Party, because I felt like there were things greater and bigger than politics. And when we put our hope in powerful men, we're told not to do that. In fact, the Bible that I think is the Bible, which is the book I subscribe to the most, says don't put your hope in powerful people. There's no hope there. And yet that's what we continue to do.
So in terms of, the Tea Party disbanding, the Chattanooga chapter of it disbanding, were you surprised when you heard that?
I had been told it was going to be doing that. I guess it's a little bit surprising to some extent, but then on another hand, it's not. As the letter itself said, there's other groups that in essence do the same thing. And the Tea Party for a number of years has just pretty much been the Republican Party, just another arm of it, so to speak. So while it's disbanding, those people will fold into existing organizations and basically continue doing and saying the same things they have for the last 4 years.
So when you think about, the Republican Party and kind of how it's changed, I know you don't identify as a Republican, but when you think about kind of the changes in it, do you think that, I guess, the last 4 years, Trumpism has kind of changed the party?
Oh, the party's definitely changed. The things that were important to it 10 years ago, 20 years ago are no longer important to it. The things that were important to it 5 years ago were not important to the last 4 years. All of a sudden, they will become important again because they've lost power. And so I think with this, if there's any lessons that we see, and this is not just directed towards Republicans, it's directed towards politics in general. Politics is first and foremost about power. It's not about all these other things. All these other things are secondary to power. And so if you lose power, all of a sudden, those principles seem to be important. But if you gain power, those principles are no longer as important. It's just holding on to power. And that shows you, in my opinion, a real core problem with politics in general. The other issue is, I think, which is really key to, I hope everyone in Chattanooga that might hear this listens to this, and that is this. You're not going to change Washington, not whatsoever. You are not going to change Washington. But you can change Chattanooga. You can touch your neighbor. You can reach out during COVID and help someone in need. You can take some food to a neighbor. You can show love to people here locally. And that's where you change a life. You'll never change a politician, but you can change a life. And when we reach out and touch our neighbors, that's exactly what the story about the Good Samaritan was reach the person who was in need right there that you were touching and seeing. Don't worry about Washington, D.C. It's going to be there tomorrow, next year, following year, with a new leader every 4 years from a different party, and you're not going to affect that whatsoever.
I kind of want to ask two more things. So one, when the Chattanooga Tea Party was really active in their community, what were some of the things that you were pushing for locally?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily proud of this right now, but at the time, we were pushing for a recall of a mayor, and we were successful, actually, well, along with some other groups, temporarily. It was ultimately overturned. I'm not proud of that now, looking back at it, but we were certainly successful. We were successful at a domestic partner ordinance, which I think was a good thing. Not that I would want to take rights away from people, but I think it was a fiscal issue, and it was expanding a budget that was already in trouble. And so that was something that at the time was extremely successful. It polarized the community, though, as politics does. So would I spend all my resources on something like that? No, I wouldn't do that now. It wasn't wrong, I don't think, but I just think there's better ways to do things than to always go through the political channels.
And then lastly, we heard a story today. We're also speaking to a new group called Gen Z GOP.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Gen Z GOP.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but part of our story is basically they're a group of Generation Z Republicans who, as they talk about the different iterations and movements in the Republican Party, they're hoping to, I guess, bring in more millennials through Republican policies, talking about some things that appeal to millennials. Do you think that there's room in a party or I know you're not part of the Republican Party, but do you think there's room for expanding conversations and new movements of Republicans coming forward?
Oh, certainly. I think there's room. I don't believe that because a party stumbles and stubs their toes that there's not hope for it in terms of just purely politics. But I would still caution these young people, young folks, to not put all your eggs in that basket. Because, okay, I've been through around 10 or 11 presidencies. I voted, the first one was Ronald Reagan. And one thing we know for sure, we can look just right now, everything that Obama accomplished, so much of it was overturned by Trump, okay? Whether by legislation or a lot by executive order. But what have we seen in the last week? We've seen so much of what Trump did and bragged about has been overturned by Biden. So every 4 years there's this overturning. So I say to the young people, don't put your hope in a party. Don't put your hope in a man or a woman. Okay, they're gonna constantly disappoint you, and don't put your focus in a city that you're not gonna touch. Put your focus here. If you want to do it through a party, okay, but reach out and touch a person. Touch a person. Touch a heart. Don't touch a policy or a legislation or whatever, because those change as quickly as we change diapers on a kid. But touch people. Touch a person's life, and you will ultimately change perhaps eternity.
I think, those are the questions I have. He's going to continue to get a piece out of us chatting. So, I'm just curious. So you no longer identify as, Tea Party. You don't identify as Republican. You independent or kind of doing your...
Yeah, I'd be independent, of course. I mean, I'm going to vote if it makes sense. I didn't vote for Biden or Trump. Mm-hmm. I didn't vote for Trump 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. But politics just... it's funny. It was my life for 10, 15 years. It was literally my life. Just like this is probably, to some extent, your life.
Yes.
It was my life. I mean, I put everything into it. And I don't regret that, but I learned a lot.